Welcome to the Three Martini Lunch. Grab a stool next to Greg Columbus of Radio America and Jim Garrity of National Review. Three Martinis coming up.
Hey, so glad you're with us for the Wednesday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. As you know, Jim Garrity is away. If you're reading the Morning Jolt, you know where he is and what he's writing about, so I encourage you to check that out. Here in his place today is Inez Stepman of the Independent Women's Forum. But since she last joined us, she's gained a much more important title, Mom. Congratulations on your baby girl, and thanks for being with us today, Inez.
Thank you. I hope she'll be quiet for the podcast.
That's always the dream, right? Well, we have a lot to talk about today. We're going to talk about one of the reasons it seems that young people are gravitating at least towards Donald Trump, if not the Republican Party as a whole. We will also talk about President Trump's executive order on in vitro fertilization and making that easier and potentially cheaper for people. But we're going to start with the president's legislative agenda. And this is an issue that hasn't got a ton of attention on Capitol Hill yet because we're still embroiled in all these confirmation battles. And of course, there's a blizzard of issues that we're looking at every day. Doge is dominating the headlines and so forth. But Donald Trump today putting his thumb on the scale in terms of what he wants to happen legislatively with a lot of different areas. Politico with the story here. President Donald Trump threw his support on Wednesday behind the House's budget blueprint, throwing a curveball into the Senate's plan to vote on a competing version this week. In a Truth Social post, Trump said both chambers are, quote, doing a spectacular, all caps job on spectacular, of working together, but added the House budget was preferable because it would fold all of his priorities together instead of separating them into two bills like the Senate GOP plan would. Quote, we need both chambers to pass the House budget to kickstart the reconciliation process and move all of our priorities to the concept of one big, beautiful bill. It will, without question, make America great again. His announcement comes the day after Senate Majority Leader John Thune announced that the Senate would take up its budget framework this week. Under the Senate GOP's plan, Republicans will try first to pass a border, energy, and defense bill, and then come back later this year to try to pass a separate bill on tax cuts. The House budget plan would package all of those together into one sweeping bill. And Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, plans to bring the measure to the floor next week, but is still trying to win a number of holdouts because we've only got, one or two votes that he could possibly lose here if the Democrats all stick together, which they probably will on this. I think we're down to 218 in the House. And if they ever actually confirm Elise Stefanik, we're down to 217 to 215. So, Inez, what do you make of the effort? What do you make of Trump preferring doing it all at once as opposed to in two different pieces?
I think Trump has learned from the Obamacare repeal battle. If anyone remembers that far back into political history here, we move at the speed of light, I know. But so I think he learned a lot from that because the end result was nothing because Trump didn't have a clear sort of legislative list of priorities in that battle. And so hurting Republicans was like hurting cats, right? And so the end result was that there was no Obamacare repeal, even though it was part of Republicans and Trump's promise going in. And we know how he cares about it. I don't think he cares particularly about Obamacare, but I do think that he cares about promises made, promises kept, right? So I think he's learned from that. I think he's learned he has to be more legislatively involved and he has to be sort of the leader. He has to throw down the line that then Republicans will sort of try to deviate from one way or the other. This bill has critiques from both sides, as you mentioned, of a very narrow margin. So it has bill critics from the sort of moderate side where they're worried about Medicaid cuts, and then critics from the opposite side, so worried about the fact that this once again raises the debt limit, worried about the fact that we're still spending far beyond our means. And I've noticed also in terms of Donald Trump's legislative efforts, Donald Trump doesn't really understand ideologues, which I think is kind of an interesting personal quirk to all of this. I think he just doesn't have, for example, a good mental map of a principled conservative like Chip Roy, because what he wants is actually what he's demanding, right? He wants the government to stop spending beyond its means. And it's I think Trump has a more wheeling and dealing, art of the deal, real estate mogul kind of attitude. I think he has difficulty understanding people who are committed to the principle of a thing. But in any case, that's more of a psychological thing. It'll be interesting to see what ultimately happens with this bill, and a lot can happen in reconciliation. If I may add just one more thing that I hope will happen potentially in reconciliation, there is a possibility that the endowment tax on universities will be raised from the 1.4% that it currently is, which is a pittance, to the more normal. There's two proposals out there. One is around 14%. The other is fully to the hedge fund tax. The normal hedge fund taxes, these are hedge funds with universities attached of about 35 or 37%. So that's something that can happen through reconciliation. So that's really, I think, where we're going to see if conservatives are going to get our budget priorities or not will be through that reconciliation process.
You will see Inez's happy dance if the endowment tax comes through. That is one of her biggest priorities getting done. And with the Republican Congress and a Republican president, it's about the best opportunity to do so. Of course, that narrow margin in the House, my guess is this could get pushed back to after they fill those 2 Florida House seats if they can't get every Republican on board here. But it'll be interesting. I mean, they basically twisted all the Senate arms on these confirmations, except for Mitch McConnell on some of them. But in the House, getting everyone out of 217 or 218 on board is not easy when the Democrats are just going to be thumbs down all the way, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, speaking of Mitch McConnell, I mean, the pettiness of forcing J.D. Vance to walk 500 feet to cast his vote on things that McConnell knows are going to happen. Yeah, there's definitely a divide there. I mean, it is, from the 10,000 foot, it is interesting. It will be interesting to see if Donald Trump continues to assert himself legislatively in a way he didn't that first term, where he kind of just left the details to the Republican senators or the Republican House members. If he continues to assert himself, it's going to be harder and harder for any of these Republicans to resist him because, frankly, he has the mandate of the election. He has the popularity among Republican voters, not the Republican Party. So I think it's going to be harder. If he decides to stick his hand in legislating a lot more this term, I think we might actually see, I mean, I would be excited to see what we might actually be able to get out of our Republican representatives as opposed to what we've been able to get in the past. Yeah,
there's a much more coherent plan this time. Last time, 7 years of we're going to repeal this thing, and then there wasn't any agreement, or at least a broad-based agreement in the party on what to do about it. A lot of people didn't want to go with the straight repeal, which had been the talk. And then the thing that did pass the House eventually was somewhat convoluted and obviously got killed in the Senate. And so seems like they're hitting the ground running, obviously, a lot better than last time. We want to let you know that this podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp, and hopefully 2025 is off to a great start for you, and hopefully it's going to be a great year all the way through. But if you are struggling with things, including relationships and other factors in your life, and you just need some better insights, try BetterHelp. And one of the things that BetterHelp is focused on right now is red flags and green flags. You know about the red flags, the relationships and the people that really aren't good for you, and you shouldn't be spending a lot of time around. But in a lot of cases, you know what those are. What about the green flags? How do you tell which people are right for you? The people who are going to have the right influence on your life and point you in the direction that you really ought to be going. Well, if that's not something you're clear about, give BetterHelp a try. BetterHelp is fully online, making therapy affordable and convenient, and serving more than 5 million people worldwide. You can access a diverse network of more than 30,000 credentialed therapists with a wide range of specialties, and you can easily switch therapists anytime at no cost. Discover your relationship green flags with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/3ML to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/3ML. All right, Inez, on to our second martini now, and the executive orders have been fast and furious also in this administration, coming up on almost a month of the Trump administration, 30 days today, but it'll be an exact month to tomorrow, February 20th. One of the things he promised to do during the presidential campaign last year was to expand access to in vitro fertilization. It was one of his ways of pushing back against criticism from the pro-life community during the campaign, because he had taken out some of the pro-life language from the platform and so forth. He also said he wanted to make things more affordable here. So this executive order says it would support American families and is the policy of his administration to ensure reliable access to IVF treatment, including by easing unnecessary statutory or regulatory burdens to make IVF treatment drastically more affordable. And then Section 2 of this order, I think, is the most significant one, lowering costs and reducing barriers to IVF. Within 90 days of the date of the order, the Assistant to the President for Domestic Policy shall submit to the President a list of policy recommendations on protecting IVF access and aggressively reducing out-of-pocket and health plan costs for IVF treatment. So, Inez, there's a number of different issues related to this order, and we've already seen the pro-life debate break out on X and elsewhere, where there's, of course, the moral argument because you're creating human embryos, that is human life, and in many cases, many of those embryos do not get implanted, and they're either destroyed or perpetually frozen. Other people, of course, they struggle with fertility, and this is the only way they've ever been able to have the children they so deeply want. Perhaps the one area of consensus on this is, should taxpayers be footing the bill for this? During the campaign, it seemed much more clear that that's what Trump meant. We'll see what the recommendations are within the next 90 days. Making this another entitlement, I think, is an area where a lot of folks would put up the stop sign. Just
to talk about the last month, I mean, I think this has been probably the best month of governance for the right in, I think, in 100 years is arguable, certainly since Reagan. I don't think that's even arguable. So generally, I've been extremely happy with these EOs. This is probably the first EO that Trump has put out that I actually object to. But then again, you can't really blame the guy for saying, I mean, he said he was going to do it, and he did it. So can't really say that he misled us in any way about it. I'll put it that way. I do have ethical objections to IVF. I think actually the smallest piece of it is this pro-life issue of the treatment of early embryonic life, right? Human life, how it gets either destroyed or put on ice in this very indeterministic way. But I think there are serious other problems with it ethically. We aren't really understanding. I think most people don't understand that during the course of IVF, there's eugenic screening, both for sex, and increasingly our technology is making it possible to screen for all kinds of things, right? For, height, for eye color, for intelligence. And so this is already happening in Silicon Valley. Already have billionaires, probably including Elon Musk. I know a lot of his kids are IVF. They're using this technology not because they can't naturally conceive, but to conceive, quote unquote, the best children, right? To bring, I shouldn't even say conceive, to bring into the world the quote unquote best children. Gene editing coming down the pike, where you're not even choosing among children that embryonic children that you've created for the best qualities. You're actually editing their genes to be different than the genes that either of their parents would give them. There's a potential for children with multiple parents beyond two. I mean, there's a lot of very serious ethical questions surrounding taking reproduction and human evolution in this direction. So I definitely don't think we should be paying for it, but I think we need to have the kind of bioethics council as a minimum first step, the kind of bioethics councils that we had about cloning or about stem cell research, because we're taking control of our own genetic evolution here, away from nature or God or whatever you prefer. And I think there are a lot of questions that need to be answered before we go gung-ho off a cliff.
Paging Aldous Huxley, based on what you just said there. That's
Gattaca, actually. I think we're speedrunning to the movie Gattaca.
Unbelievable. And I would love to see a fiercer and greater push towards adoption of existing children. There's still a great supply of them out there, and I think that would solve the moral dilemma and, to some extent, the financial dilemma as well. That's not a cheap process either. But
well, that's something that actually could be extremely streamlined. I mean, people totally underestimate, I think, if they haven't seen someone go through it or gone through it themselves, to the difficulty of going through the adoption process. I mean, it's very, very hard to adopt in this country, and perhaps we should be looking at making that easier instead of making it, on the taxpayer dime to do infinite IVF selection.
All right, Inez, let's move to our final martini here. And one of the things that was noted, but is a little bit overlooked from the 2024 campaign. The big headline was Trump got all the swing states, he got the popular vote, and he would say a mandate. And but one of the demographics that went his way, and a lot of them went his way more so than for other Republicans anytime recently, and that's young people. Young people historically had been deeply, deeply to the left, but young people, and particularly young men, are moving more towards the GOP. And now there is a theory coming out on this that it's actually because of COVID. There may actually be a positive development from the COVID pandemic, and it's because young people basically had their lives disrupted for a very long time, missed out on some of the biggest moments of their lives, graduations, proms, a normal college experience, at least for a year or two. And so this comes to us from Town Hall, but the analysis comes from Derek Thompson, who writes for Atlantic, is not a righty. But Thompson says, why are young people in the U.S. and around the world shifting right? I wrote about a phenomenon I call Generation C, the young people whose experience with COVID's health, political, and economic crises caused a strong shift right among young people across the developed world. In the U.S., between 2020 and 2024, voters under 30, and especially young men, shifted 20 points towards the GOP. In Germany, France, Portugal, Finland, and beyond, young voters seem to be swinging their support toward anti-establishment, far-right parties in numbers exceeding older voters. So what's going on? Probably many things. The world is an incumbent's graveyard right now. Inflation is a scourge. Immigration is creating headaches for centrist and progressive parties throughout Europe. But I also think that in ways both obvious and non-obvious, this is a COVID phenomenon. The pandemic era didn't just demolish faith in scientific and political elites. It also strongly increased alone time, sending young men and women in highly gendered social media spaces where the youngest men in particular seem to have become significantly more anti-feminist and open to right-wing influencers and parties. So there's his more left-wing political spin on this, but he's at least on the outskirts of what's really happening here. People saw what big government looks like just as they're becoming able to take part in the process and seeing how it affects their lives as young adults and potentially professionals. And they hate it.
I kind of agree with the underlying analysis from The Atlantic, I guess. I'm not sure this is just from COVID, although I'm sure the sort of school marmy list of restrictions plays into a lot of the larger themes here. But I think this is primarily young men. If you look at demographic breakdowns in all of these polls, what we see in almost every country is a pull away from young men away from young women who are turning very far left. Even though, by the way, women also shifted to the right, but every demographic shifted, towards Donald Trump. So that's just a question of relative shifts, and young men are one of the, larger demographic shifts towards the right. And I think it has more to do with this very stifling. I mean, the word woke is so broad now as to be, functionally useless. And yet I find myself not finding a good replacement for it. But this particular ideology that interacted in a very real way with young men's lives. I think there was a particular pushback against being told that when, there's less dating, there's less sex, fewer potential opportunities. It's very difficult to get into university or get hired, for example, as a straight young white man. I think that interaction with the power structure that was created by this particular part of the woke left has created a reaction. And I think COVID might be part of that. I mean, certainly, I'm pretty sure that young men noticed the same thing the rest of us did, which is, we were all locked down until the racial left-wing cause took off in June of 2020, right? So I'm sure they noticed that, and I'm sure it fed into it. But I think it's a part of a larger phenomenon of rejecting what is, frankly, a kind of, I would say, middle-aged female, as a middle-aged female myself, right? A middle-aged female-dominated sort of power structure and ideology that shut out the ambitious young white men. And I think that they've reacted to that in a way that's probably reasonable. They've rejected it. Now, it's possible to go too far in rejecting a bad thing, but thus far, I think it's a good thing.
Yeah, and I think you make a really important point to remind everyone that those two things happen simultaneously. You had the big hand of government with the lockdowns, and also the big hypocrisy of government, as well as more aggressive DEI, or at the time CRT policies in the wake of George Floyd. And so those twin factors smacking young adults in the face, I think, is a significant factor. And of course, some of that had been already building up prior to COVID, but to see all of that being implemented at the same time, I think is pretty significant. Do you think it's a lasting pushback, or yet to be seen?
Look, politics is generational, and usually the politics that you set for yourself in your early 20s, you tend to perpetuate throughout your life. There's been some really interesting work done showing the curve of the different generations, right, and where they were when they were young, on the sort of, yes, generally you see generations getting a little more conservative over time, but they tend to kind of stick where they were, and then the political fissures move around them, right? So what we've seen is that the millennial generation, until this last election, the millennial generation was actually much further left at are middle age than the boomers were, than Gen X has been, whereas Gen X is curving actually substantially to the right. So Gen X is to the right of where boomers were at their age, millennials to the left of where boomers were at their age. And then until this election, we thought, okay, Gen Z is going to be to the left of millennials. It seems like that's not going to be true, at least for Gen Z men. It seems like Gen Z men are very much going to follow the Gen X trajectory in terms of U.S. politics. But I mean, we'll have to see. Of course, it's not necessarily good for social comedy to have young women be extremely left-wing and young men be extremely right-wing, but we'll see how that plays out.
Gen X dragging America to the right spot for 40 years now, at least. And lastly, is this a Republican thing or is this a Trump thing? I
think it's a Trump thing, but I think that applies to so much of, I mean, I don't know that there is now a future for Republican politics that isn't a Trump thing. I think, just like we saw in 2016 or 2008, even just everybody on the Republican stage say, no, I'm more like Reagan, right? I think in 30 years, we will still have Republican nominees saying, I'm more like Trump. I am the true Trumpist. I think he's an era-defining politician. I think he's a great man of history. I think we're going to be calling this the Trump era for a very, very long time.
We will certainly see, and we will talk to you again tomorrow. Inez, thanks for your time today. We always appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
Inez Stepman of the Independent Women's Forum. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Please subscribe to our podcast. If you don't already, tell your friends about us as well. Thanks for your 5-star ratings and your kind reviews. Please keep those coming. Get us on your home devices. All you have to say is play 3 Martini Lunch podcast. Find us all on Twitter. Inez is at Inez Felcher. Jim is at Jim Garrity. I'm at Greg Corombos. Have a terrific Wednesday. Join us again Thursday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.